when we're born into this world, we have two needs: the need to be authentic and the need to attach.
Yeah.
And the need for attachment is far greater than the need to be authentic, because if you don't attach, you die. As a little baby, you have to stay attached to adults because you're so helpless. So oftentimes you suppress your authenticity to stay attached to adults. But the Dr. Gabor Mate says, anytime you do that, you suppress your authenticity, that is when trauma is created.
Yeah.
And the more authenticity you suppress, the more you will need to chase that feeling of attachment later in life.
Yeah.
Usually with drugs, and it's leads to addiction. So when I see these addicts on the street, one thing that I've talked to some of them, it seems like one thing they all have in common is a very traumatic childhood.
Yeah, or traumatic experiences in the military is another big one. There's something I'd like to share with you. Angeles Arrien, who is a famous shaman anthropologist, she spent 10 years traveling the world and went to over 100 countries and spoke to the natives, the elders, and addicts and families of addicts. And she was looking for what caused addiction. And after 10 years of research, she reviewed all of her evidence, and she found that there was 4 common factors that led to addiction, and they're quite profound. And I've used this work extensively because I've worked with countless addicts in my career. It's kind of hard to find anybody these days that doesn't have some form of addiction. I mean, they're out there, but there's not. I mean, if you took 100 people out of any crowd, probably 80 of them have addiction problems. And these are the things she found. Intensity. If the upbringing of a child was in an intense environment, that is a precursor to addiction. If the parents focused on what was wrong more than they focused on what was right with the child, that's a precursor to addiction. If the child had parents that were perfectionists, which is very common, especially in Christian families where the children are put under tremendous pressure to look a certain way, to act a certain way, to not listen to certain music, to not wear certain clothes, to not look at certain art, to avoid certain television. There's so much pressure on the child. So that if the child's environment was such that the parents spent more time focusing on what was wrong than what was right, perfectionism, and then focusing on what's wrong. So intensity, the need to know, that's another one. If you, for example, go to school and find that you're not mathematically, logically inclined, and 98% of all education in our education systems comes by way of mathematical, logical learning, but only 5 to 8% of the world population learns well that way. You've got kinesthetic learners, you've got auditory dominant learners, you've got visual dominant learners, you've got people that are more artistically inclined, more musically inclined. Howard Gardner identified about 12 different types of intelligence amongst people, but 98% of our education comes by way of mathematical, logical reasoning. So a child can be very, very gifted, but not good at memorization and passing tests. And so what happens is the child sees that the kids that are good at memorization and passing tests start getting favors from teachers. They get more love. They're more appreciated. Their parents show them more affection. So if one sibling is really good in school and the other one's not, then the other one starts getting pushed to the side or criticized. And so what it leads to is an addiction to the need to know. So these children will start thinking that they've got to really pour themselves into memorizing and doing their best to try to keep up with the Joneses, so to speak, and it puts so much stress on them, it leads to addiction. And interestingly, a few years back, I did research on the rates of suicide in people under 20, and the highest rates of suicide in children under 20 were in New Zealand and Japan. And what the researchers identified was Japan had the highest scholastic standards for high school graduation, and New Zealand had the second highest scholastic standards. And so they showed that the high rates of suicide, they tracked it right back to pressure in high school and kids feeling so inferior that they couldn't keep up, and their self-esteem just got destroyed, and they found that it was easier to kill themselves than to try to play this keep up with the Joneses in high school and college. And so there you see that it sets you up for this sense that if you don't know enough, that nobody's going to love you, you're not going to be valued, you're not going to be wanted, you're not going to be needed. So to review those: intensity, focusing on what's wrong, perfectionism, and the need to know. Okay, so here's the punchline. Everyone listening, were you raised in an intense environment, such as mom and dad not getting along, or intense fights with brothers, or an environment where there was just a lot of intensity in the household and you could never really relax? I was. Were you in an environment where your parents focused on what was wrong more than what was right? I was. Were you in an environment where your parents had this bent toward perfectionism and you always had to meet up to certain standards, or you were potentially going to get punished or be diminished? Fortunately, my parents weren't perfectionists, but my father had very, very strict rules with intense punishment for not doing jobs correctly, not taking care of animals correctly, etc. And then, were you in an environment where there was others around you that were celebrated more than you because they did better at passing tests, and you realized later that you just didn't naturally learn that way? Well, you count up the number of people that fits into 1, 2, 3, or 4 of those, and you've got most of the population. And so the addiction, I did a whole course called the 1, 2, 3, 4 for Overcoming Addiction, Obesity and Disease, and I showed that the addiction is actually a surrogate that allows a person to feel loved without any attachment or risk. No matter how you suck a cigarette, it doesn't complain that you're a bad kisser. No bottle of booze ever tells you that you're not a good lover. No heroin ever makes you feel bad about yourself. So what I found consistently is that all addictions are coping mechanisms, which is exactly what you said, a need to connect, but a mechanism of either numbing the pain or allowing you, for an example with psychedelics, to feel more connected. And I think that's one of the reasons we're having another huge wave of psychedelic revival, is so many of us are broken, that psychedelics always have this beautiful capacity to open you, so you feel the plants and the trees, you feel the sun, you feel the moon, you feel the stars, and you feel, because as the ego breaks down, the firewall that creates this sense of isolation dissolves, and all of a sudden you feel yourself to be one with nature, you feel yourself to be connected to the people around you, and that's ultimately giving the sense of the secure attachment that we needed, particularly in the first 2 years of our lives, in order to navigate the earth plane without feeling broken and scared all the time. So really what we've got is just a world full of metaphorical orphans that even though they were raised by parents and sent to schools, they felt disconnected, they felt underappreciated. People were more interested in forcing them into their rules than you consider all the hell and damnation and punishment and the scary shit that kids are indoctrinated with religion, and the 3 main religions being Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, all of which have, heavy restrictions and rules and regulations. And, what do you think happens to a kid when they think God paradoxically loves it but will burn it in hell for almost anything that it wants to do? And so what do you get? You get what you see when you look out the window every day. You get what you see when you turn on the television or social media. You get exactly what we've got now.